مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. 2017 العام الأول من رئاسة ترامب كان عاما غريبا. الصعيد السياسي كان عاما صعبا وشاقا على الرئيس، لم يحقق فيه سوى القليل من الانتصارات التشريعية وحفل بالتحقيقات والفضائح والشعور متزايد بتفاقم أزمة. وبرغم ذلك الصعيد الاقتصادي كان عاما جيدا لأمريكا، حيث ارتفع معدل النمو وانخفض معدل البطالة وازدهار سوق الأسهم. 2018 سيجلب تغطياته الخاصة. الصعيد السياسي أكبر قصة لهذا العام ستكون انتخابات التجديد النصفي في نوفمبر. عادة الحزب غير المتولي للسلطة، في هذه الحالة الديمقراطيون، يحقق إنجازات كبيرة. هل سيتكرر هذا النمط هذا العام أم أن الرئيس سيفاجأ الخبراء كما فعل في 2016؟ والصعيد الاقتصادي بعض الخبراء يقولون أن الانتعاش يقوم على الأسس واهية جدا. هل ستستمر أمريكا في النمو أم ستنفجر الفقاعة؟ لإلقاء نظرة على العام المنقضي واستقراء أحداث العام القادم، يسرني أن أرحب باللجنة تضم خبير سياسي وآخر اقتصادي هما بيتر موريتشي وتوم روغان. Welcome back to Dakhil Washington. Well, it's the end of the year, an end of a very eventful year, and the start of what I'm sure will be another challenging and newsworthy year here in America. To discuss 2017 and to look forward to 2018, I'm delighted to have Peter Morrissey and Tom Rogan. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Nice to be with you.
So let's take a moment first to look back. When you look back at 2017, what, in your view, not the president's view, but in your view, was the president's biggest achievement during the year? Peter?
Well, restoring confidence in the American economy. You can't get around the fact that over the last 3 quarters, it looks like the fourth quarter is going to be plus 3% as well, that the economy is growing much more rapidly than it did during the Obama years and going all the way back to 2004. So that's a notable achievement. The other thing is that the stock market's up dramatically, and that's based on this notion that this is a more pro-business government, it's a more pro-growth government, and so forth. Whatever personal feelings people may have about Mr. Trump or Mrs. Clinton or Mr. Obama, of the three, he's much more pro-business, more laissez-faire, and businesses like that, and they're more willing to, quote, do business in America because of that.
Okay, so the improved economy and the business climate. Tom, what would you say is the biggest achievement?
I would say bringing back a sense of traditional realism to American foreign policy, and a couple of examples I would point to there. Firstly, the president's decision to enforce the Obama red lines and his own red lines in Syria in the aftermath of a chemical weapons attack. But secondly, the notion of American power in places like Afghanistan, simply saying that the president listened to his advisors and then decided, actually, where before I would have said, let's pull out, here we are going to keep some troops in this advisory role as long as it takes, even though American forces are not taking as many casualties now. And I think that matters in the sense that it says to allies abroad and also to foes, the United States is going to be living up to its commitments. And we saw, obviously, with the withdrawal from Iraq by President Obama, prematurely, I would say, the degradation of that spirit of American confidence. Of course, we will see what happens with North Korea, with China, with Russia. So there are question marks about the president's policies. But you know, on that baseline of realism, I think that is an important benefit.
And I think that he's willing to call the Europeans and the allies to task. And I don't just mean those early days about NATO's contribution financially and so forth, for which he got results. I mean, one of the problems here because of Mr. Trump's personality and his penchant for tweeting, that people deny that he has accomplished some things in foreign policy which are very notable. And one of them is to basically call to task false assumptions and to call to task, quote, the diplomats. The whole notion, for example, that somehow or other getting the North Koreans to the table is going to get them to give up their nuclear weapons is silly. You know, I often heard the phrase, to a man with a hammer, every problem is a nail. Well, to diplomats, every problem is has a diplomatic solution. And in reality, some international problems, when you're dealing with certain personalities, do not have a diplomatic solution. And the problem in North Korea probably is that. The problem with trade in China is probably that. And folks don't like to admit that international institutions have their limits, that the European Union has its limits and the WTO has its limits.
The World Trade Organization.
Right, the World Trade Organization has its limits, but they do. And in the end, there's no substitute for American power. There's no substitute for British power. There's no substitute for Saudi power. These things are part of the world we live in. We might not like that, but it's the way it is.
All right, so a renewed sense of realism, challenging assumptions that are widely held but wrong, and the economic improvement. These are the collective assessment of what the greatest achievements were of 2017. Tom, let's take a look at biggest disappointments.
Yeah.
Things you had hoped the president would accomplish, and he either didn't try or didn't succeed.
Well, I think two things stand out. The first is the failure to pass any kind of healthcare replacement. That was a big priority both for the president and Republicans, they said in Congress. But in the end, it wasn't able to get over the finish line. Now, as much as that is, I think, in significant part a failure of congressional leadership, I also do think it reflects the president's struggle to unify the Republican Party around him. And again, there are a lot of Republicans who have always been reluctant to get behind the president. They don't like his tweeting, they don't like his style. But to some degree, as Harry Truman said, the buck stops at the president's desk. And the president hasn't been able to unify that movement in a way that I think quite a lot of Americans and conservatives, of course, particularly would have liked.
So not taking advantage of the Republican majority in Congress to achieve.
And we come to the end of the year, there are,
anything
as
yet
of yet,
significant.
with the struggle to get any legislative accomplishments.
Okay.
I think it's
Peter?
important to recognize that an illusion is created by the fact that America has a strict two-party system. I mean, there's, I believe, only one independent senator. I don't think there are any independent representatives. Either you're a Democrat or a Republican, and if you're independent, you caucus with one of them. However, inside of the Republican Party, there has always been in the Northeast a faction which is more liberal. We used to call them Rockefeller Republicans when I was a kid. He was governor of New York in the 60s.
This shows your age.
Exactly. But then again, with that comes experience, wisdom, and
Exactly.
knowledge. In any case,
I'm not going to hold it against you, Mr. Kennedy, right?
Right, exactly. I'm not going to hold it against you. Well, Sue Collins from Maine is really a Democrat when it comes to her predilections towards legislation. She wants to preserve and extend the welfare state. When you only have a majority of 52 to 50, that's a dead giveaway vote. In some measures, some of the other Republicans are that way as well. So it is very hard to push through legislation when, in fact, in the Senate, for all intents and purposes, it's a minority government. They have a plurality of senators by a very thin margin of about 2, but they don't have a working majority. The Democrats are different. The Democrats hang together more tightly. That is not necessarily a sign of strength. It means to me that they're a party more of talking points. There's no diversity, there's no discussion, there's no debate. They do what they're told.
So actually, this is one of the questions I wanted to get to, which is when we begin to shift from 2017 to 2018, already one of the first 2018 stories is, will there be a shift in the cabinet? Lots of rumors swirling about the change of Secretary of State. Tom, what's your view of this?
Yes, I think there will be. At the moment, we see a push to try and have the Secretary of State resign on his own accord. And I think that does reflect that the President Trump in particular, and it is something I think President Obama reflected as well, enjoys having manifest control over foreign policy and its messaging. He does not like it when other individuals in his cabinet, in this case, of course, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, seem to offer their own take on foreign policy or create some measure of differential from what he's saying. And ultimately, as the president, it's his prerogative to have a problem with that. And I think that is why we will see Rex Tillerson.
Do you think these sorts of changes will actually have any impact on the efficacy or the success of American foreign policy? Is it about the people?
I think it is. Tillerson is very skilled, and Tillerson's a very realistic man, but he hasn't been realistic in one regard. There is no diplomatic solution to North Korea, and he has sort of taken the European view that somehow or other diplomacy will work and that sanctions will work. Now here is a good example of the problems they're having because of the absence of economists. There's an Undersecretary of State, supposedly, for Economic Affairs. I believe the position is still vacant, where you put an economist. The whole history of these things is that sanctions only work if everyone participates. Everyone includes China. China is using North Korea kind of as a way of preoccupying the Trump administration to keep them off the trade issue, to keep them off the South China Sea issue. So the longer they can keep the Korea issue in play, the longer they can do what the Chinese have always done to American presidents, wait them out till the next guy comes along. Tillerson has gotten caught in that game. Donald Trump's a negotiator. He's not particularly articulate, but he is a negotiator. And what he's seeing here is a negotiating mistake, and so he's acting on it, and he's going, "You're fired."
I do think, though, on the China issue, I mean, the choice for the administration now is to put in aggressive sanctions that would target Chinese financial entities. The consequences of that, of course, would ripple into the US economy, or we believe would ripple into the US economy. But the choice of doing that as well would perhaps pressure China to alter, and I agree with that conception of China's interests. The only way you could alter that interest is to create a cost-benefit differential in their decision-making. And at the moment, we are unwilling to do that, and so the diplomatic options become inherently limited.
Well, there really aren't diplomatic options because that's not really
an
diplomacy.
economic diplomacy.
That's really what I'm getting at. It's not even economic diplomacy; it's a hammer. You're basically going to impose a severe sanction.
Okay, we're going to have to come back to this this discussion after the break when we look at the entire range of initiatives, options, and where the news will be in 2018, the second year of the Trump administration. In just a moment. Again, our guests today include Tom Rogan. Tom, an American with a British accent, is a political columnist for The Washington Examiner and a contributing columnist to the National Review, one of the premier journals of conservative thought in America. A former panelist on the McLaughlin Group, his writing and broadcast commentary have appeared frequently in major media outlets here in the States and across the Atlantic in Britain. Sitting to his right is Peter Morici. Peter is Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland's Smith School of Business, a recognized expert on economic policy and international economics. He served as Director of the Office of Economics at the U.S. International Trade Commission. He is the author of 18 books and monographs and has published widely in leading public policy and business journals, including the Harvard Business Review and Foreign Policy. Dr. Morici has lectured at more than 100 institutions, including Columbia University, Harvard Business School, and Oxford University. So, gentlemen, let's take a look again at 2018. Let's say you're the president. You just won a very narrow tax reform victory, but there's a lot of blood on the floor of Congress with it. What do you begin the next year with? What's your top legislative priority? Peter.
Well, they say it's going to be infrastructure. The U.S. infrastructure, that is roads, bridges, and so forth, like a lot of things were neglected during the Obama years. Mr. Obama was very much into building out the welfare state and basically taxing the military to do it and taxing other domestic priorities. He gutted the space program. He didn't put enough money into research and development. Not all that stuff can be replaced overnight. But I guess the two basic fiscal priorities are going to be more money for the military because of our expanded overseas issues, and going to be infrastructure, trying to push through a bill to improve our roads, bridges, airports, rail lines, and so forth.
Okay, Tom, what do you think?
I do think that's correct in terms of the infrastructure issue. The challenge for the president will be, how do you pay for it? Do you pursue something like a gas tax or sales taxes, or do you, probably not sales taxes, but do you tolls on roads, for example? And how much of that, where is that money actually going? Because there will be concern by Republican members of Congress that a lot of that money will go to what they will perceive as big union projects, things that the Democrats find value from, but don't necessarily have as much return on investment in terms of infrastructure in the purest economic sense. On foreign policy, I think we will see a push, obviously, on the continuing effort to try and alter North Korea's behavior. Again, the question is, how successful will that be? And then on Iran, there I think will be a push by the White House, along with the French government in particular, to try and strengthen some of the sanctions that apply to the Iran nuclear deal, to expand them into the field of Iranian ballistic missile research. And again, to understand why that is a priority, we only need to look at North Korea and the level of concern that that ballistic missile program is posing for American and regional security.
This is where the pacifism of European diplomacy really can be seen in its most visual and tangible effects. They truly captured the mind of Barack Obama. A lot of what we did in terms of foreign policy was very much in the notion of this kind of global governance vision of the Europeans, of pooled sovereignty and so forth, and it's left us with a very menacing state in Iran. And one of the first things that Donald Trump learned about in his first visit to the White House upon winning the election was that the North Koreans had the bomb. Now they have to deal with that. With Tillerson's exit, the two people I wouldn't want to be is the guy running Iran, and not so much the guy running North Korea, but President Xi of China. Because China's been up to a lot of meddlesome behavior, a lot of very, kind of nasty behavior by using the North Koreans as a ploy, and in doing that, he's gone just a little bit too far. And that is, he's basically made Seattle the target of a mobile nuclear device. Somehow or other, that has to be dealt with. But more than that, the United States can't afford to have China indefinitely behaving this badly. This is like Fagin in a Dickens novel, the man who taught children how to steal. He turned North Korea, a small satellite state, into a very, very nasty situation.
Okay, so a rising confrontation with China, tightening on Iran, and seeing whether or not we can even drag the Europeans along with some of this. Let me put this back into the American domestic context for a minute, because there is this large cloud hanging over the Trump administration, the Russia investigation, or whatever it is morphing into, as we see just before our eyes. To what extent, when you look at 2018, do you think that this large cloud will in fact have a big impact on the administration and even some of its highest ranking members?
It depends on whether the investigation by Robert Mueller, the former head of the FBI, goes into areas of financial issues, of real estate, of areas where perhaps Russian money, through questionable elements in Russian society, found its way into the Trump administration, and specifically whether any of that money can be drawn to imply that President Trump has behaved in certain ways on certain issues to try and placate the Russian government. That's a hard thing to do. If that can be done, if that is done, if that exists even, then the president has a problem. Absent that, I think President Trump will look at the current situation, the indictment of certain individuals, for example, Michael Flynn, his former national security advisor, for making false statements to the FBI, as pretty weak ball stuff, as stuff that doesn't necessarily affect him, as stuff that doesn't come anywhere close to the kind of narrative that has been presented by the president's opponents of collusion with Russia. So it's all, we shall see, but I think 2018 will be the decisive year.
One of the things that we're seeing here is the consequences of most Americans not understanding that Washington is sort of an industry, and it takes real Washington skills to be in Washington. I saw this a lot with people that campaigned for Trump, that supported him, who sort of thought, well, gee, you know, I've been CEO of XYZ, and I'll just come in here and do the same thing in Washington, and I'm so much smarter than those underpaid bureaucrats, which is what Tillerson is doing at the State Department, and be just fine. And Mr. Tillerson doesn't understand that he works for the President of the United States. Likewise, the President of the United States doesn't understand that he can't always put, for example, a relative in an important position, like his son-in-law. De facto, a very important man, Jared Kushner. My feeling is what's going to come out of this is that if Trump really is not implicatable, either he colluded with the Russians or he didn't. If he didn't, but it's clear that there's been an awful lot of contact, it's been because that, frankly, we had neophytes running around. Most of us operating in Washington would have known better than to have meetings with the Russians during the campaign and during the transition. We would have known better than to do that. You just don't do those sorts of things. I look for some of those people to be sacrificed to save the president. Probably his administration is going to be better off for it, because some of those people, it would probably be better if they left.
So you can really sacrifice members of the president's family and the president himself escaping unscathed?
The son-in-law, yes.
Okay, let's put this in the context of one more very big event of 2018. It's an election year. Midterm elections in November. Normally the party out of power does well in these elections. Some pundits are suggesting the Democrats will do very, very well. Are they wrong?
Well, look, I think they might be. I think the functional issue here will be, what does the economy look like if it continues as it is at the moment? That will be very much in Republicans' favor. Does that have a tangible impact both in economic empowerment through companies investing more, through that fueling the general economic growth, and then through American families feeling some tangible benefit? If those two things happen, I think Democrats will have more of a problem. Again, one of the things we always do in America, especially in Washington, is to obsess about polling. Well, if you need any more evidence as to the flexibility of polling and how things can change, just look at who sits in the White House.
Okay, let's think about that a year from now when we look back on 2018. We only have a few seconds left. Tom, if you could think of one big wild card that could change this entire picture in 2018, what would that be?
Well, I think it has to go down to North Korea. I mean, anything could happen there. We could have another Korean War.
So North Korea is the big wild card for you. Peter, what would you say?
If Tillerson goes, the China trade, because I wouldn't be surprised if they try to do something very tough with China and it disrupts the relationship. From my point of view, if I were the Trump administration, I'd try to do it through North Korea, not through trade.
All right, so for both of you, the big wild card in 2018 is East Asia, China, North Korea, that equation. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking us back to 2017 and taking us forward to the year ahead. Thank you for joining us on داخل Washington. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول مسير السيطرة الجمهورية على كونغرس الولايات المتحدة، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@الحرة.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.